Hi, everybody. I'm Liz Weaver. I'm a Vice President with the Tamarack Institute, and joining me today are the authors of the recently released book, You're It, Shared Wisdom for Successfully Leading Organizations, from both a seasoned and first-time CEO, Alan Broadbent and Franca Gucciardi. Thanks for joining us, Alan and Franca. I'm going to begin by just giving quick introductions to each of you and sharing your bios with folks that are on the line with us. So Alan Broadbent is Chairman and CEO of Havana Capital Corporation and Chairman of Maitree, an organization that's committed to advancing systemic solutions to poverty and strengthening civic communities. He has co-founded and chairs a number of initiatives, including the Caledon Institute of Social Policy, the Tamarack Institute, and the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance for the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Alan is the author of Urban Nation, Why We Need to Give Power Back to Cities to Make Canada Strong, and co-editor of 5 Good Ideas, Practical Strategies for Nonprofit Success. He's a member of the Order of Canada and a recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal. Franca Gucciardi has served as CEO of the Lawrence Scholars Foundation, a charity that identifies and supports exceptional young Canadians who demonstrate character, service, and leadership since 2004. Prior to this, Franca designed and implemented Canada's Millennium Excellence Award Program. She's the incoming CEO of the McCall McBain Foundation. In the community, Franca is the board chair of the College Montrose Children's Place and a member of the Leadership Council of the Ian Ignatowicz Institute for Leadership at the Ivey Business School. She is a fellow of the International Women's Forum and a recipient of the Gil Bennett Gold Standard Governance Award and the Sarah Kirk Award for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. Whew, full mouthfuls. Welcome, Franca and Alan. We're so pleased to have you. We're so pleased to have you join us today. I thought I'd begin with a question, and I think that this question can go to Franca in the first place. In this book, you're talking about the life cycle of being a CEO. Can you maybe explain that a little bit, Franca?
Well, the book is meant to be a companion for the CEO, so really begins from when you're even considering stepping into the role, and right to the end when it's time to leave. So that's sort of why it's the life cycle. It doesn't really sort of take you sort of in the middle of it, but really sort of figuring out, is this the organization I should lead? Am I ready to be the CEO? And then am I ready for something else?
Wow, that sounds really interesting. Alan, from your perspective in terms of thinking about the book as a life cycle book, how would you characterize it?
Well, the book really grew out of a conversation or a set of conversations that Frank and I have been having for many years before Franca went to Loran when she was at Millennium. And of course, Frank and I knew each other when she was a student. She was the first recipient of the Loran Scholarship. And we just had a conversation about what both of us were doing and what she was doing, and at one point she was had the Millennium job and then was offered the chance to come to lead up Loran, and so we talked through that. You know, is this the right job? Am I ready? How do I think about this? And as time went by and we kept meeting because we enjoy each other's company and we both learn something from each other every time we meet. As time went by, Franca looked at me at one point and said, "We should make a book out of this. This is a book." And so that because we had in effect been dealing with a life cycle, with whether you're ready, now that you've got the job, what do you do? How do you manage problems as you go through? We decided to really do it in that format, that it iteratively walked through the various steps leading into a job, through the job, what the challenges are, what some of the tips are for doing it well. And now we've, of course, Franca is leaving Loran and moving on to McCall McBain, and so we've talked through that whole cycle as well. How do you end? How do you leave it better than you found it? How do you leave it in good shape for your successors? So it seemed almost a natural outgrowth of the conversations we'd been having.
Well, it's really interesting because it is really the critical pieces of being a new CEO, but then walking through the whole cycle. So that's really interesting. You also focus on the nitty gritty, the day-to-day work that separates a mediocre organization from a well-managed one. What do you mean by that? What are some of the things that the CEO has to focus on in order to kind of get to that level of excellence that you try to aspire to, both in the book and in your work?
Well, let me start by saying, I guess, the title of the book is The Seasoned and the First Time. And even though I guess I've been here so long now in this role, that doesn't really feel like it anymore as a first timer. It is particularly aimed at that sort of moment of like really sort of taking on that step. And oftentimes in our sector, you see that people just like me were director of programs before they move on. So they're sort of the senior in terms of really being responsible for programs, and they move into the CEO role. And I guess what really the book is trying to sort of do is help you make that leap from knowing how to run something really well and being responsible for the actual operations piece of it to really leading it. And and this is why the book is called You're It, one of the pieces that I think is particularly critical is to really feel like, when you're the director of programs, you still have a boss. There's someone who at the end of the day is responsible for the organization. And sometimes when we make the leap into the CEO, we think the board is equivalent to that boss. And yes, the board is responsible for the organization and for making sure that the organization actually has the right CEO and the right strategic plan and has solid fiscal plans. But at the end of the day, you are it. You really have to own everything. So even if the board makes a bad decision, you have to own that and say, that's probably because I didn't provide them with the right information, didn't have the conversations necessary that they needed to have. And so the sooner and the quicker you kind of make that mental shift into really owning what happens and feeling responsible, the better your organization will be for it.
Yeah, and I think what happens in that process, I think Frank is absolutely right, is that when you step out of a particular role and you take responsibility for the whole organization, you actually have to broaden out the knowledge you have of the organization in a significant way. And so you may, to use Franka's example, have come out of leading programs, but suddenly you have to understand the whole financial structure of the organization. You have to understand the human resource management aspects of it. You have to develop the overall strategy for the organization. And particularly when it comes to things like finance, a lot of people in the sector don't come up through a finance education or have a finance understanding. And one of the risks in the community sector is that people never do learn that, and they always kind of offload that to somebody else and say, well, we have somebody on the board who handles that, or I've got a finance person if my staff is big enough to handle that kind of thing. And I guess the advice that we give in the book is that you can't do that. You don't have to do the finances yourself. You don't have to, do all the adding of all the columns and that sort of thing. But you do have to know enough and learn enough to make sure that it's being done properly, because, of course, finance is one of the places that can be a big pitfall for an organization if things go badly. So you don't, quite often we get asked the question about, does this mean micromanaging? Do you have to go down and do all these jobs? No, you don't do them all, but you have to have enough knowledge and enough awareness to make sure that these jobs are being done properly, particularly the critical jobs that can present real risks to the organization if they're not done properly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and particularly, I think you're absolutely right, Alan, about the financial management part of an organization. But there are other parts as well. This is a question aimed at both of you. Do you have a favorite section of the book, and is there one piece of advice that you'd like to have the readers take away, or even our listeners on the call today? So, Franca, why don't you start?
Favorite part of the book. Perhaps board management, either board management or fundraising. I don't know which one I'd pick of those two.
You're good at both of them.
Or maybe it's because I enjoy them both so much. But I think because once those two things are really done really, really well, like you notice it. So on board management, I'm going to pick that one to talk about. Because I also sit on a number of boards, and I think many people probably are listening in feel the same way. You participate as a board member, and one of the complaints that I hear oftentimes from other CEOs is about their board. A lot. You know, oh my God, those guys, if they only, you know, it's as if like, if we could just get rid of them, I'd, you know, it'd be so much better, right? So I could move faster, I can do stuff, they don't understand, they're blocking me, they're not agreeing with, you know, all that kind of thing. And I think, and that's a tricky business, that relationship between board and CEO. So I think it's you know, I had to sort of make that switch, you know, I had to, and I made mistakes, particularly in those first few years around the way I managed our board. But once I kind of learned to accept responsibility for what was going on in the conversations and the level of the conversations around that board table, it really helped. So one tip, for example, I give around that is that to deal with each of the board members individually, spend lots of time talking to individual board members. So that you really have a good sense of really what motivates them to be around the board table in the first place, and what strengths they have that the organization needs, and to put those strengths at work for the mission and the vision. And once you do that, what happens is that everybody's kind of coming along because there are no surprises. You know, you don't present things at board meetings without them knowing all about it. I already know when I present something at the board meeting who is going to say what, because you've spent so much time with them that you know what, you know, how they think about the work. So you kind of have addressed it before you get there, and so then you can elevate the conversation. You know, you've given them each individually the things they need to make sound decisions.
And Alan, what about you?
Well, I guess the thing that the overall message that I think is important from the book is that while it may seem daunting at the outset, moving up to become the CEO and the leader of the organization, almost all of the things that you need to be able to do can be learned. Yeah. You know, we talk sometimes about born leaders and assume that some people are just you know, created fully formed as leaders and they have all this natural talent. But in my experience, and I think Franca would agree with this, almost all of the things, I would say all of the things you need to be able to do and do well can be learned. You can learn, you know, as I said before, finance. You can learn strategy. You can learn human resource. A lot of people, when they come into leadership roles, don't understand that how important it is to be able to articulate the mission and the vision of their organization in a way that is inspiring to people, that makes people want to be involved. And but you can learn that. You can learn how to speak well. You can learn how to structure a narrative that is persuasive and inspiring. All of these things can be learned. So you know, the one thing we can all control is how hard we work at something. And if we work hard at learning the skills and learning how to do how to become a good CEO and a good leader, it's very achievable for everyone.
I think that's a really important point. Franca, this question is for you. What do you wish you had known when you first became the CEO, and how do you think that would have made you do things differently? Because you were coming from a program manager position into the CEO position, so.
Well, I mean, there's sort of very technical things that I wish I would have known about coming into Loran that would have probably, like, I wish I had asked a lot more questions around the financial position of the organization. I was just so excited with the opportunity. I just sort of jumped into it. And it wouldn't necessarily have stopped anything from happening. That it wouldn't change anything. But I would have been wiser in the sense of really understanding the type of organization I was taking over. Equally, I think I wish I would have understood how important it would have been to ask the chair of our board, and as soon as I came in, why I was picked. I didn't do that, and we talk about that in the book, and that's a really important piece. People feel shy about asking it, but it's actually really important to find out why they picked you, because in that choice was basically the vision they have for the organization and why they think that you're the right person. So is it a turnaround? And so they picked you because you talked about making things changing and being excited about actually turning an organization around. Was it actually the opposite? That they're really happy with where the organization is right now, and when you talked about it, it really gives a sense that you would be the stability that they needed. So this is what I mean. It would have been really good to just to know that I could have done that and that I should have done that.
That's really wise advice. It would be good for any position, I think, to really find out, why they picked you. What was it about your unique characteristics, or the interview process that drew them to you? So I think that's really, really wise advice. Go ahead.
Sorry, just to add, it's because I think sometimes we think we got picked because we're the better one. It isn't a question of being better, right? When you're looking at that level, it really is a question of alignment of culture, experience, and sort of vision that you have. And so that's the point, is that you have to really focus on that.
Very good. I have another question for you, Franca. And this really goes to that, people talk a lot about those first 90 days or those first 100 days in the office. So how would you suggest that people organize their first 90 days when you're joining a new organization? And what are some of the key opportunities that you have, especially when you're new to the organization?
Well, there's really one, which is people will tell you the truth. So for the first 90 days, you have to go talk to people and listen, because it's the only time they don't have an association with, they don't associate you with the work of the organization at that point. So they will all tell you really what opportunities are being missed, how they feel about the organization, what they really think should be happening in the future. After that 90 days expires, you're basically you're being associated, right? So they don't necessarily, they feel funny about sort of letting you know if there's something that's not happening, because they think it's also you who's not making it happen. So it's the only time in the life of the organization that you really have the opportunity to kind of get to know what every stakeholder around you really feels about the work of your organization.
And so it's not only asking the questions, but you mentioned something at the very beginning of that answer, which is to also listen.
Oh, actually, that's all you're supposed to do. There's such a, I have the kind of personality where I get really excited and I already can see sort of things that I'd want to do. And that is the worst thing that you could do in those 90 days, because you don't want to promise anything. You have to just sit there and let a lot of just, even if it's dead air, go by, and they will fill it. Don't feel the need to sort of say and promise stuff already. Let the work show who you are and what you're going to be capable of doing. But for those 90 days, you just go talk to everybody and get to know who really are the huge sort of decision makers or trump cards around the organization, who you'd have to bring on board for whatever change you think is important to bring about.
Alan, anything from your seasoned professional perspective that you might want to add in here about those first 90 days?
No, I just think that what Frank has said about listening is critical. You don't know how many people in an organization have felt unheard, and just giving them that opportunity to be heard in itself is liberating and helps build morale. And that includes directors and staff and donors and anybody else involved. And as Franca says, you'll just learn a ton of really useful stuff. Yeah.
So this next question is for you, Alan. Is there one particular area where you see new leaders struggle beyond the kind of listening piece? Are there other areas that you might see them struggle in terms of some of your experiences?
Yeah, I guess I would think I'd go back to a little bit what I was saying earlier, and one of the things we all tend to do, I think, is we have an idea of what we're good at, or if not that, at least what we like doing. And I think people tend to focus, when they want to impress and want to succeed, they focus on what they're good at and what they like doing. And the fact of the matter is they'll probably do those things fairly well anyway. And it's probably useful to begin to focus on some of the gaps that you have. And I mentioned some of those earlier. But begin to think in a very structured way about how you're going to fill those gaps. Or if it's a finance gap, who can you find that you can talk to, who can become a mentor, who can in a regular set of meetings in a regular way, make sure you learn what you need to know. Any of the areas that you perceive as things you should know more about that you don't. And they may not be all that interesting to you, or you might not like them that much, but they are going to become necessary parts of what you're doing. And so just think in a very structured way about how to do that. And I guess if I see people struggling, it's because they haven't done that, and there's just some stuff that perplexes them that they don't know quite how to deal with, but they haven't thought of a structured way how to bring their knowledge level up on those.
So it is either learning more things about that particular area that's a gap for you, or finding mentors. And I think mentors is a really interesting, that seems to be what you found, Franca, and with Alan, in terms of having those conversations that led to the book. So I think that's really critical. Alan, another question for you. For someone just starting out, or maybe curious about whether they have what it takes to lead an organization, what would your advice be to those individuals? They might be program managers, they might be people that are just kind of exploring new opportunities. What would you say to them?
Well, I'd say that what I said a few minutes ago is that you can learn all the stuff you need to learn. I don't think acquiring the proper toolkit of skills and abilities is hugely problematic. I think the first question you have to ask, though, is, do you really want to lead? Do you really want to be the leader? Is there something about that beyond just personal ambition, or something on a resume that you want to have? And back to what Franca said earlier, you're it. The responsibility is yours. The onus is on your shoulders. Yes, you can share it to some extent with board and with colleagues, but really, it's a lot harder than having somebody to report to, or just having part of the portfolio of an organization. And I think you really need to ask a set of personal questions about how hard you want to work, how committed you want to be. And I always, Frank and I kind of kid each other a bit about, we both tend to be pretty focused on our work. And I always ask the question, do you wake up at night, when you wake up at night, do you think about your work, and do you think about your organization? And do you do so in a positive way? Is this a chance for you to solve some problems and solve some issues? If that sounds horrible to you, you may not want to really lead an organization. So I think you just have to ask yourself some very hard questions about whether you're personally committed enough. And very often it's what will commit you is the mission of your organization. That you know that the work that your organization does is so important that you just want to lead it to make it succeed in a way that it hasn't before, and that you can bring something to it significant in that regard. But those are hard personal questions and you need to have, I think, very honest personal answers to them.
I want to ask a question that isn't necessarily on our script, but Franca and Alan, as you were both writing this book, or kind of co-authoring it together, was there an aha that kind of whacked you on the side of the head and went, oh, yeah, that makes sense, and I needed to have the reflection of writing that actually helped me come across that aha? So, Franca?
So it wasn't one moment, where I thought, oh, this thing I didn't know, now I've articulated it. Actually just sort of made me realize, though, as we were writing it, how much I'd learned. I don't think, right, because I think you just, once you know, and you forgot that at one point you didn't know it. So I think it did make me realize that, just that I had grown into the role. And, confident I actually felt as time went by and years went by into it, that I felt confident the choices I was making were the right ones. because I don't think I had that before. So just the self-reflection. And I think in you probably as a CEO, you're kind of always kind of doing anyway. So to have, and you don't have many people you can kind of talk to around even your own learning, because everything that comes out of your mouth is obviously associated with your organization. And so you have to be pretty sensitive to that. And you know, so your moments of doubt and questioning and all of that are harder to share. So being through this book with Alan really provided me with that opportunity.
I would say the aha moment was when Franca said, "This is a book. We should write a book about this," because you know, it identified that there had been a structure of our conversations, and that it might be helpful to some other people if we actually wrote it down and made a book out of it.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I commend both of you, because I think it is really a good legacy to give to, you know, folks that are in the stage that you were in, Franca, not so many years ago, in terms of thinking about, you know, entering into an organization. And I'm sure even as you leave Lorraine, you know, you've used the thinking to make other decisions into your future. So really, really interesting. So we're going to now have the opportunity to open the floor up to questions. And so those of you that have a question for Franca or Alan, you can type it in your chat box. As a reminder, if you've joined us online, you can write the questions in the question box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar panel, or you can tweet us questions using the hashtag TamarakConnect, and I'll ask Megan to help me with questions in a moment. But in advance of the call, we had a number of questions that were submitted by folks that were registering for the call. And so I've kind of picked a few from that list to start us off. And so the first one that I found really interesting was how do you effectively create an intergenerational culture of respect and collaboration in organizations where generations are overlapping? So Franca, you're coming in as a younger leader into an organization. I think probably you've had a range of staff in your organization. So how do you kind of build that culture?
Okay, well, two things, I guess. Like, I've always worked in intergenerational. I've always sort of, oftentimes, not anymore, mind you, I stopped being now the youngest one. Slowly it happens to you. But I have been. And I guess, you know, I don't know if it's any different than respecting all differerences in your team, right? Wanting, age is one of them, but the diversity comes in all shapes, sizes, and real personal choices. So for me, it's all the same. I really believe in having that kind of a diversity in our staff and an openness, you know, so there isn't, you know, there's just a respect for who we are and what we bring. So I know that sounds kind of basic, but the only other thing I will add is that if you're one of the older CEOs out there, I'm a big believer that you have got to also pay attention to what new generations bring you, and really sort of, it's not acceptable to sort of say, well, I don't believe in doing these kinds of things. You know, in our organization, for example, we have it's all young people, right? It's Laurean scholars, and I never had Facebook, because I never, you know, I don't believe in that. And then I realized it doesn't matter what I believe for my own personal life. But as the CEO of Laurean, I needed to come in to the social media because that's where our young people were. So not only do I needed to do it, but I needed to find the joy in it, and embrace it, and make it something that I could stand behind. So I think it's really, really important when you're leading that it's not about whatever you choose to do, you know, and the choices you're making, but you need to be accessible and open to everybody in the way that they want you to communicate to them, not the way I want to be.
And Alan, I'm going to twist the question a little bit for you, because Maitri is well known for its cross-cultural work in terms of really trying to bring a variety of diverse voices into the conversation and into the workplaces across Toronto. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned in that work?
Well, I'd reflect back to what Frank had just said, that it's part of having respect for everyone, and that in our organization we that is a value we have. We have the value of humility as well, and that we don't think we're better than anyone, or that our work is necessarily more important than anybody else's work. I think the thing that a leader needs to focus on, though, is articulating these values and doing so on a regular basis, and demonstrating the values. So to Franca's point about younger colleagues, listening to them and asking what their point of view is, and what their input on the issues that we're dealing with and the problems we're trying to solve. And similarly, if we have older colleagues, to make sure that they're similarly involved. And as leader, I think it's important on occasions like we have two lunches for staff a year, one at the around the Christmas period, and one in the summer. And on each one of those occasions, I get up and I take an opportunity to just say a few words about the organization that capture some of its values, and just plays those out, so that we all kind of understand that that's the way we want to be as an organization. So beyond simply having the values, I think regularly finding a way to articulate them and to demonstrate them, to kind of walk the talk, is important.
So Franca, this question is, I think, directed at you, but Alan, you can feel free to weigh in as well. But any insights regarding the ED-CEO relationship with the board chair? Because it's a unique relationship. So as you progress through your role, do you have any insights around that relationship?
Yeah, so I've had, for our organization, the chairs only have a 2-year rule, which, by the way, I'm a big fan of. So there needs to be rotation built in to the role. So we have like vice chair, then become for 2 years, then you chair, and then past chair. So you still have access to them, but it is important to sort of limit it. And so in my role here, I've worked with 7 of them. And each one of them is a human being, and they have different levels of experiences as chair, and different approaches. So it goes back to something I said before. So I'm a strong believer in lots of one-on-one, that you kind of have to really spend the time with each one of them to kind of figure out how they tick and how they want the information being given to them. What are some of their major issues that you need to address, so that when I walk into the board meetings, the chair and the CEO are together. I mean, I should not have forwarded something to the board without the chair feeling that the document or the idea is at a stage where the board is ready to accept it. So I think the work needs to really happen between you and the chair outside of that boardroom. And when you're walking in, the chair is with you, essentially. And then together you're going to receive the information that's been at that board table, and you're going to have the conversation. But it really, really is important to figure it out. You just have to figure it out. Whether you like them, you don't like them, it doesn't really matter. You have to find a very productive way to use this person's strength and to walk into that boardroom together.
We have a lot of questions coming in on the chat box, or in the chat box, I should say. So, Megan, do you want to perhaps read one of the questions that we've received?
Sure, yeah. We've gotten lots of questions, so thanks for everybody who's typed in so far. Some of the questions are kind of coming around a theme, so I'll ask this one in particular because it's come up a couple of times. How often should you be evaluated as CEO? Do you suggest specific ways of evaluation or gathering feedback from your team?
Should I jump in, Alan?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm evaluated annually. I have a performance review, and the way it works is that we have a strategic plan, obviously, in the organization, and the strategic plan then is turned into annual work plans, and those obviously have measures and very clear guidelines of things that we need to achieve for that year. And then that turns into basically my my goals for the year. So every year I have the 4 or 5 key goals, and then all the all the measures for each one of them. And then annually, I would go into a meeting with my chair and a couple of other executive committee members. I will have actually reported, provided them with a written report on those objectives, and as well as a draft of the objectives for next year, which of course, if you have all these work plans, it's all there, right? So it's not new. And so that's how it happens. And annually, we have a discussion.
I would, I've been on the kind of other side of what Frank is talking about, because I chaired a number of organizations over the years, and so I answer a little bit of the previous question, but also this question as well. I think the most, for me, the most successful experiences I've had, and I think organizations have had that I've chaired, is when I as chair would talk on a very regular basis with the CEO. And I think that conversation, that ongoing conversation, it could be as infrequently as every 6 or 8 weeks, or more frequently. But that regular conversation, that just covering the broad spectrum of things that the organization is doing, most of which should, as Franca says, be captured in the plan. It is a way of being able to support the CEO when they need the support, being able to ask the questions that maybe you don't feel have been asked, being able to push back a little bit on some of the answers that they've come up with. And but I think that having that regular conversation enables that. And I also think it really helps in terms of evaluation. So while we typically do an annual evaluation, very often in the case of the organizations like Maytree that I'm closest to, those conversations are relatively short, because we've covered virtually everything in our regular conversations. With Maytree, it's almost a daily conversation with our president, and in other organizations that I've been close to, it's been a very regular conversation, so that things don't build up. There's no kind of pent-up tension or unanswered questions. We kind of both know what each other is thinking and where things are going. And I think you might also think, just organizationally, there are probably a few, in larger organizations in particular, there are a few other key people beside the board chair. So it might be the chair of the audit committee, or depending on what kind of what the mission of an organization is, it might be a program committee or some other committee, that just making sure there are regular conversations, as Franca has said, is really important, and reduces the kind of the weight that can fall on a single annual evaluation, when kind of everything's at stake and everything's suddenly on the table. So I just this whole idea of talking regularly between CEO and key members of the governance structure, I think, is pretty important.
Megan, do you have another question for Alan and Franca?
I do. Here's another one from Kate Mulligan. Any tips for people with significant responsibilities outside the workplace, people with parents of young children, caring for aging parents, etc.? How and should we take leadership?
I hope I am understanding the question correctly. So I'm just going to answer from someone who has a child at home, an aging mom, and I guess it's sort of like I'm right in that period of my life where you have all of that happening all around you. So, and really there isn't any one way to answer that, because you kind of have to figure out at different moments what is the priority. And I get asked that question around work-life balance, and I guess my number one thing is, first of all, make sure that the thing you're doing at work is worth it, because if you doesn't actually provide you with joy and opportunity to contribute in a positive way in the world, then the responsibilities outside of workplace will feel shortchanged, and they won't actually get you to. You don't have the energy to give to them. And then at any point in time, you have to have the flexibility that sometimes it's my daughter that has my is really what is needed. I need to focus on her on this day, in this week, in this month. And other times it's work, and other times it's the other stuff. And to give yourself the opportunity to realize that the day doesn't have to be perfect where everything is balanced in one day, but the life does. So it's sort of a very holistic kind of picture, and to figure out the kinds of things that are important to you and in the priorities.
Yeah, I think it's important in being respectful to those kinds of external obligations that people have, that as employers that we're sensitive to them and we're aware of them. And I think it probably is important between the employer and the employee to work out a plan of how it's going to be dealt with, so that it's not just all ad hoc or all just kind of made up. Now, obviously, things happen on the moment that require people to be away from work and look after those important obligations that they have. But if there is no plan and there is no kind of awareness on the part of the employer that there are these other pressures, then it can sometimes go sideways on people fairly quickly. So I just think it all needs to be on the table. It all needs to be negotiated. At the end of the day, the job, we're talking about CEO jobs here. I mean, that job has to be done well, and if it's not being done well, then a serious conversation has to take place about how to deal with that.
Megan, can I actually jump in, because I saw there was one question around staff, inherited staff.
Mm-hmm.
Can you read that one?
Yeah, sure. Let me just. Here we go. So what advice do you have for a new leader in a community organization that has inherited staff who is committed and passionate, but not necessarily competent in the functional areas they're responsible for? Most of my experience is in the private sector. How do I handle this differently in a not-for-profit / community organization setting so as to be able to move the not-for-profit forward and not deflate the staff?
Good question.
That's one question. Go ahead, Franca.
Yeah, the reason I sort of wanted to bring it up is that when I came to Loran, I inherited, a staff, lots of lovely people, but not necessarily all of them are perfectly aligned with where the organization was and needed to be, and that's tough. But this is where it kind of goes back to you again being the CEO. And I remember actually somebody saying to me that once, as a chair, he talked to a CEO, and the CEO complained about the staff, saying, "Oh, they're kind of subpar," or whatever it was. And he looked at him and sort of said, "Well, I don't understand. You're the CEO. I mean, if there's no excuses. You cannot complain about the staff. If you're complaining about the staff, you need to make the change. Period. There isn't any excuses there. You can't sort of say you can't. If you don't speak about your staff like they are the best team I've ever worked with, then you need to change something."
So that's really great. So now I'm going to hand it over to Megan for us to close off. So Megan, over to you.
Great, and thanks so much. We're still having questions coming in, and I'm collecting them. It's been a great conversation today. Thank you, Alan, Liz, and Franca for engaging in this conversation with us. And everyone's comments and questions have made this a thought-provoking discussion. We would also like to thank our supporters again, the Maytree Foundation, Ontario Trillium Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Province of Ontario for making these calls possible for us. As promised, in a few days, we will email you with links to the audio of this call and other material related to today's call. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email us at tamarack@tamarackcommunity.ca to let us know how we're doing. We also have a very exciting learning opportunity coming up that I'd love to share with you. The Community Change Institute is our signature event here at Tamarack, and will be taking place in Vancouver, BC this year from September 25th to 29th, so coming up this fall. This year's theme is Cities of the Future, Co-Creating Tomorrow, and will feature a stacked cast of keynote and workshop speakers, fascinating city walkabouts, a co-creation lab, and many opportunities to dive deep into the content with your peers from across the globe and apply what you're learning to the local context and projects in which you work. A few of the exciting keynotes that will be joining us include John Hallowell, co-editor of the World Happiness Report, Shauna Sylvester, director of Simon Fraser University's Center for Dialogue, David Corton, co-founder of Yes Magazine, Ben Hecht, president of Living Cities, and many more. To learn more and register, follow the link on your screen, and I'll also be sure to include that in the email after the webinar. To learn about all of our upcoming events and webinars like this one, you can also discover latest resources, articles, and tools and thinking on community change. Visit our website at www.tamarackcommunity.ca. Also visit yourit.ca to learn more about Alan and Franca's book. You can read a sample chapter there and also get more information about ordering a copy for yourself. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.